I work at a 24-hour convenience store. I usually work days, sometimes afternoons. The latest I'm out the door is normally 11 p.m. The only reason I was on the night shift was because all three of our night guys were unavailable. One was on vacation out of state, one quit without notice, and the third had to be fired unexpectedly. My manager is too lazy to cover her own butt, and she was pissed at me for other reasons. So she scheduled me overnight without any notice that she was changing my schedule. I worked the morning shift one day, had the next day off, and was scheduled to come in overnight the next night. In doing that, she was able to consider me to have had a day off without giving me one. And she had the night shift covered. Needless to say, I wasn't able to get my sleep adjusted very well. I walked in to work the shift on only 3 hours of sleep. Once upon a time, that wouldn't have fazed me. But man, I'm getting too old for that now. Fortunately, we're a busy as heck store, so during the first few hours I had no problem staying awake. I just felt like hammered shit. At 11, it was time for the second shifter to leave. I made his last act ringing up a few energy drinks for me, but resolved not to drink them if I could stay awake on my own. I'm getting too old for those, too. I had no problem keeping myself busy, though the store got quiet about a half hour after the guy left. At my store, the night shift does a lot of cleaning chores and stocking. Being the person on first shift who had to double up when the regular third shifters didn't get their work done, I resolved to show them how it's done. Basically just for bragging rights. I really threw myself into the work, and by 1 a.m., I had half of the night's chores completed. I was putting the cappuccino machine back together when he walked in. There wasn't anything incredibly remarkable about him, at least not where I live. In a small country town, he'd have stood out, but around here a long-haired dude in all dark clothes, including a hoodie, looks just like every other metalhead, emo, or goth who walks into the store. He didn't answer when I sang out, "Hello!" And he didn't return my smile, but it was 1 a.m. Again, it's not unusual for people around here to be kind of on autopilot when they come in at night. He meandered into the candy and baked junk food aisle, apparently browsing for a late-night snack. I kept an eye out for him approaching the register as I reassembled the cappuccino machine. 5 minutes went by, then another 5 minutes, and he was still in there. I couldn't even hear him moving around. I wondered if he was okay. Having finished putting the machine together, I returned to my register, where I would be able to see down that aisle. He wasn't there. I casually stepped to the next register and pretended to check the cigarette pack rack above it, actually looking down the crunchy junk foods and jerky aisle to see if he'd gone down there. No, dude. Weird. I'd just come from the drink aisle, so I knew he wasn't there. I could see the windows from the stuff for your car aisle, so I knew he wasn't there. I hadn't heard him go into the restroom. Where the hell did he go? Just as I was beginning to wonder if I'd imagined him, I felt kind of a watched sensation from my right, and returned my stare to the drink aisle to see him stepping out and around the deli case at the end of it. He stopped, stared at me for a moment, then wandered down the crunchy aisle. I glanced at the clock and realized that another 5 minutes had gone by while I was trying to pretend not to look for him. Odd. How had I missed him? I thought I must be getting less observant due to fatigue. I gave up on toughness, opened the energy drink, and chugged some of it down. Then, I began stocking cigarettes. That meant a momentary trip to the back room, but there was a monitor there where I could see the whole store. I stayed back there just long enough to grab an armload of cartons of the different varieties I'd need. There are way too many varieties of cigarettes on the market, keeping an eye on the monitor so I'd know where the guy was. I kept telling myself I didn't want to make him wait when he was ready to check out, but really, I was getting nervous. It wasn't extremely unusual for a group of people to take 5 or 10 minutes trying to figure out what they wanted, but most individuals came in looking for something specific, bought it, and left. Very, very few people were in the store for more than 10 minutes, doing anything but chatting with the cashier. This guy sure wasn't chatty. I watched him for a minute on the monitor, thinking maybe he was a shoplifter waiting for me to not be looking. I could see him on the screen, and if he took anything, I could get the license of his car for the police, but I wouldn't do anything to stop him. We're instructed not to do that. I wanted to text a buddy of mine to come see me at the store, a guy I knew would still be up, but who wasn't working tonight. He had said he'd come bug me to help me stay awake, but I hadn't seen him yet. Boy, would now be a good time. I couldn't do anything though. Store policy forbids us to have cell phones at work, because the teeny boppers don't know how to stop using them long enough to ring people up. I couldn't make a call without being heard, so I just went back out to the front counter. I began working on the overhead pack racks instead of the wall, with the thought that those were most important because that's where we stash the cigs we sell the most. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I really didn't want to turn my back on that guy. When I pulled the first shelf down, he came out of the crunchy aisle and momentarily stared at me again. I smiled, opened my mouth to offer him help if he needed it, and then couldn't speak. I wouldn't say his expression was glazed over, just kind of vacant. It's the kind of expression you see on someone who has just been given shockingly horrible news and can't process it, or on someone who tripping. I did notice that his eyes were really, really bloodshot. So much so, in fact, that it was hard to think of them as not just being red. Great. Jesus. I didn't want to be alone with someone who was that high. Who knows what he would do? I had no way of knowing what he was on without interacting with him. And then, if I said or did the wrong thing, I could set off a violent reaction. As he stood there giving me that half-vacant, half-preoccupied, totally confused stare, I mentally weighed and measured him. He was a head taller than me, but he was thin. I'm not fat, but I'm not thin. I figured my best bet if he started acting up was to run out the back door and keep going. That would get me away from him and set off the alarm. The guy stopped, turned, and went back down the candy aisle. He walked down to the end, turned around, glanced at me, then rounded back out of sight. I realized I'd been frozen in place the whole time. God, I wished that guy would leave. I was no longer trying to pretend to myself that he was just looking, and I was just stocking cigarettes. I watched and waited and listened. I could hear his sneakers padding and shuffling against the floor. He was in the crunchy aisle again. I heard him touch some of the chips, but it didn't sound like he picked anything up. It really sounded more like he was just poking at stuff on the shelves. Was he seeing what was in front of him or not? He could be on acid or some other hallucinogen. That would explain the expression pretty well, and the lack of response. If that was it, I hoped he didn't start having a bad trip. I'd probably die of a heart attack if he started screaming. Part of me was kind of resentful. My boss was going to get an earful the next day. Why the hell did this have to happen the one night when I was there, and alone, at that? I heard the feet coming back around to my end of the aisle. I braced myself for him to come into view again. Instead, I just about jumped out of my skin as the loud beep that signals the door opening went off. I barely stifled a scream. My buddy started to razz me as he walked in the door. Sleeping on the job there. Didn't mean to wake you. He kind of laughed as he approached the counter. I motioned him to pipe down. I kept watching the aisle. The guy did not step out. I didn't hear him walking anymore. He'd been just barely out of sight when he stopped. I grabbed a piece of receipt paper and wrote a quick note. Super stone junkie over there, then pointed. My buddy gave me a quizzical look. I wrote really, really tripping, creepy, and totally out of it. My buddy slowly walked that direction. I did not want him to do that. Yes, he was big and tall, but what if that guy was on something that made him not notice pain? I've heard stories about that. People get freaky on that shit. Too strong and hard to stop or escape. That was why I was worried in the first place, or at least after figuring out that he was high. My buddy looked back at me. There's no one there. Well, that had happened before. I motioned for quiet again and moved to look around the next aisle. It was empty. We looked around. The whole store was empty. The guy was nowhere to be found. Not in the aisles, not in the beer cave, which made a loud squeaking noise when the door opened. Not in the restrooms. Nowhere. I said, "Did someone walk out when you came in?" He answered, "Nope." And there were no cars in the lot when I got here either. I looked at him, and I knew he was telling the truth. I could see that he was concerned. He could tell how shaken up I was. I was really freaked out. I couldn't help thinking back to that stare and how red his eyes were. My buddy stayed around through most of the rest of my shift, until the store started getting busy again at 4 a.m. We didn't see any sign of that guy the whole night. I have never seen him since, and none of the regular night shifters have ever said anything about a creepy quiet guy coming into the store in the middle of the night shift, even when I asked. I really don't think anyone else has ever seen him. To this day, I have no freaking clue what I encountered that night. I worked that late night shift at 7-Eleven. I've only been working a month at this job, and it's already been the worst experience I've ever had in a working environment. My manager is a complete prick. My pay is minuscule, and dealing with customers is obnoxious. I should have tried in school. The saying, "reap what you sow," has never been more apparent than it is now. Thing about high school that I always took for granted. At least you got to see people and talk to them every day, and you never got that true feeling of loneliness. It's only when you go out into the real world and live on your own that you begin to realize how alone you truly are. My life consists of living in an apartment, smoking and selling bud, and playing PUBG until I finally have to get off my ass and work at 7-Eleven. I recently got moved to the night shift, and at night usually there are very few people who show up. It's always the same characters, the guy working late and getting a coffee, the high school kids attempting to buy vapes and cigarettes underage, and the stone guy buying chips. Usually, I just put on a podcast on my phone and drown it all out. This guy came in a couple of days ago while I was sitting down with my headphones in. I was listening to the No Sleep podcast, and I look outside the glass door to see this guy in a business suit, staring inside the 7-Eleven in the middle of the street. I looked at him for a little bit, just me and him making eye contact, and then I sat down and passed him off as some idiot high out of his mind, or some teenager doing a stupid prank. The guy came in, and after a minute of looking around the place, he just started talking to himself. The guy sounded like he was doing some infomercial or something. He would say things like, "Have you ever felt nauseous, anxious, scared? It's 3 in the morning and you're scared to run. But don't be afraid. There's an easy solution. There's never been a better time to try this new amazing product. It gives you the quick and easy way to not feel scared. Hello, my name is Jack Conway, and I've been with this company for years. Let me tell you, this product is one of the best I've ever had. If you are listening, please call now. At 1-800-POD. If you call now, you can get an extra 12% off. Please call now at 1-800. If you call in the next 15 minutes, we'll send you a free. He just kept going on like this until finally I interrupted him and said, "Excuse me, are you okay?" He just stared at me and kept saying the phone number. I finally had enough and called it, and when this happened, it screwed me up for life. As soon as I called that number, I felt this rush of electricity enter my body and my entire reality shifted. I was no longer in whatever realm we call our world. Everything was hazy, black and white, and distorted. The man who was standing there had become a black figure and took my phone and ran out the door. I was still in the 7-Eleven, and I could see a shining bright light. It was like a fever dream as I left and walked around outside. The sky was gray, with black clouds. I could see it was daytime, and I ran around town trying to find someone to talk to. The streets were empty, no cars, no people, and it was absolute silence. I was panicking, and I had no idea where I was. I saw the black figure in the distance. It was the outline of a person, and I screamed out to him. The guy shifted his body slightly and remained motionless. I began to run towards him, but with every step closer, he seemed farther away. I've never done shrooms, LSD, or any type of psychedelic drug, but if I ever had a bad trip, this is what I imagine it would be like. After what seemed like forever, the man finally moved and ran into a house. The door was wide open, and I went into it. It seemed like somebody's home, and as I ran up the stairs, I could see doors start to open. I could feel something pulling at my arm and trying to drag me down. Finally, I got into the room of the figure. It turned around, and we just stared at each other for a second. The figure walked up to me, and out of nowhere, it started strangling me to the floor. It knocked over a lamp next to me, and with all my power, I took the lamp and jabbed the figure on the side of the head. I kept beating it until it was finally unconscious. I could hear distorted voices screaming, and suddenly, I found my phone on the floor out of battery. I ran back to the 7-Eleven to charge it. I dialed in the number I had called before. When I dialed the number, I was back in our reality, with the man gone. One thing was off, for some reason. I had blood on my hands. I sprinted over to the security footage to see what had happened. When I saw what happened, I shit myself. I was put in a dreamlike state, and the man had taken my phone and sprinted out, and I shortly followed. I left the 7-Eleven at 4 a.m., and as I was driving home, I noticed one of the houses had police and ambulances. The same one I had entered before. I went home and got all my necessities and skipped town. I'm currently a fugitive. I don't know what happened, or who I did that to, but I'm not going back. I received a text from that number days later, with a video of me entering the house, with a text reading, "We saw what you did. We need a new host. Send this number to another person, or we will release the video." So, I thought, where would be the best place to post a number that people would most certainly call, as long as it had some context behind it? To whoever's next, I'm sorry, but this was your doing, and I feel no guilt if this is what you choose to do.
625 627.
Roughly 1 year ago, I started my second year of college. I lived on campus in an apartment, and I had gotten a job as the overnight desk attendant at the freshman residence halls. The walk to and from work was no more than 2 minutes, and overnight shifts meant I would be getting back home at 3 a.m. or be leaving home at 3 a.m. for that later shift. The first couple of nights, I was a little cautious walking the dead campus towards the residence hall, but soon I found myself walking carelessly, singing, kicking rocks. I just didn't care. Soon, this would change. I had gotten the early shift, 10 p.m., 3 a.m., so I was pretty happy that I'd get some sleep in before class the next morning. I got to work and opened the front door to the hall, which was operated with a key card that every student and I had. I sat down and clocked in. Everything was going normally for most of the night. I was studying in the empty lobby with nothing but the air conditioning vents whistling every 20 minutes. Everything was normal till around 1:30 a.m. when I heard the front door unlock. The locking mechanism shouted across the empty lobby, but to my surprise, no one came through. Odd. 5 to 10 minutes passed, and a freshman came in. This calmed me down, and I forgot about it till it happened again. Loud thud at the door, but no one comes in. I stared at the door, waiting for someone to follow up on the sound, but nothing. The door unlocked one more time, still no response. I began getting curious. I checked all the cameras on the computer at the desk. I called the other overnight people at the other rest halls to see if they were having the same thing happening. No one was having any problems. I constantly kept my eye on the door and the cameras on the computer. 30 minutes of silence went by when I noticed a shape in the camera in my building's lobby window. I looked up from my computer but saw nothing but glare. Back at the computer, and the shape was still there. I began to freak out just a bit, but I got the courage to actually go up to the window and check. My heart began racing like a little kid, hoping nothing would be outside when I look. I got up to the window, glare now gone, and saw nothing but the parking lot and the streetlight right in front of the residence hall. I sighed of relief and stared at the traffic signal. A small road intended for the school shuttle and students, so it only had a warning yellow light at night, flashing on and off the whole night. I had lived around campus for 2 years, and I had never noticed this light. On and off, oddly hypnotizing. After a few seconds of staring at the light, I went back to my desk. Thud, thud, the door again. My fears put aside. I was angry now. I figured some stupid freshman didn't know how to open the door, so I went up and opened the door to see someone running around the corner of the building. I screamed behind them, "Hey, it's okay, I'll let you in. Hey!" I took 3 steps to try to catch a glimpse, but all I heard were faint steps, growing further. I turned around and realized I locked myself out. Phone and the residence hall keycard inside on the desk. Guess I'll have to run to the other res halls to get a coworker's keycard. I walked down the steps of the residence hall, and the traffic light was flashing to my right. Yellow ball just on and off. I looked under it when I noticed a man. Not many distinct features. Just looked like he was wearing jeans and some sort of coat. I began to turn away when the man started walking towards me. I turned back at him, and he stopped. He looked up with little expression on his face. His eyes lost in another world, the yellow light flashing on and off. On and off. I took a few seconds and turned to keep walking. As soon as I walked, I heard steps behind me. I began to breathe faster. I checked behind my shoulder, and the man was now 3 yards away from me, standing head down, yellow light behind him. At this point, I realized I had to run, but where? All the rest halls are locked, so I'd be left outside till someone lets me in. My apartment is also locked, and my keys are locked inside the res hall. Where do I go? I decided to take my chances with the res hall next door. I sprinted and got to the door. I saw my coworker sitting at the desk, and I began to tug on the door. The footsteps had grown faint when I ran, but they grew close with each second. My friend started walking to the door, and I kept tugging, losing my breath and almost crying in fear. Just as the door was about to open, I felt breath at my ear and heard a whisper, "Stop." I screamed as my friend opened the door, and I ran in. He didn't see or hear the man behind me, but he mentioned the cameras had blackout on all the buildings, so he didn't know I had left my desk. I stayed at his res hall the rest of the night. I could barely talk, and I didn't want to go back out there. As the sun came out, I walked home, passing the traffic light now flashing green as cars showed up to early classes. The next shift I worked, the yellow light did not flash anymore. I began to ask people if they noticed, and they said there was never a yellow light at night. I begged my manager to switch me to another building, but she won't let me. Every time I walk to work now, I run, and I keep my key on a lanyard. As I sit at my desk, I look up sometimes, and through the window, I swear I sometimes see that traffic light turn on and off, on and off.